What is a game? Let's try to make a start on this question by identifying some things that are games, and also some things that are not games, which fail to be games in ways that are interesting and tell us something about games. A lot of the judgment as to which is which is going to be subjective, but the judgments on particular cases aren't in the end the important thing, but rather what's important is the general picture of games that emerges from the analysis. Popular and typical examples of games include soccer, chess, poker, dice, solitaire, World of Warcraft, and slot machines. Children's games include peekaboo, tag, ring around the rosy, and two people sitting on the ground and rolling a ball back and forth between each other. Unusual examples of games include war games, the Olympic Games, Roman gladiatorial combat, TV game or reality shows such as The Celebrity Apprentice, Chopped, and Lost, and abstract theoretical games like The Prisoner's Dilemma, which are studied in game theory. There's a whole category of more analogical usages of game, such as the game of life, the game of capitalism, the game of courtship and romantic love, and the game of war. By inspecting this list, we can immediately state some generalizations that are not true about all games. Not all games are frivolous in purpose. Some, such as war games, are serious in purpose. Even games that are superficially frivolous in purpose can be games where you're competing for your own life, as shown by the example of Roman gladiatorial combat. Non-lethal games can involve considerable stakes of money and glory, as exemplified in professional poker and in the Olympic Games. Roman gladiatorial combat was a game played to entertain people. In that sense, it was frivolous in purpose, but it was gruesome, violent, lethal, and expensive, so presumably there was some significant reason people went to the trouble and difficulty of putting on the games. One hypothesis I've heard is the following. Rome contained a large class of poor people who lived on welfare and therefore were not occupied with useful work, and it was found to be necessary to entertain them to prevent them from engaging in crime and disruption. If entertaining poor unemployed people to prevent them from causing disruption was the primary purpose of the games for some of the people who funded them, then certainly there was nothing frivolous about the games for those funders. For the people watching the games, the main purpose seems to have been entertainment. Another hypothesis one can put forth is that the gladiatorial games embodied the Roman values of violence, domination, and heroism, and like most civilizations, the Romans felt it was a worthwhile effort to put on events which could stand as monuments to their values. If we think of this as the primary purpose of the games, then one's inclined to say that the purpose is not frivolous, either for the funders or for the audience members. If you think of the funders and the watchers of the Roman gladiatorial games as different sets of players in the game, expanding the conceptual boundaries of the game beyond the combat ring itself, one can venture that for the funders, the purpose of the games was often not frivolous, whereas for the watchers, the purpose of the games was most often the frivolous purpose of entertainment. I am not asserting that any of these interpretations of the purposes of the Roman gladiatorial games are correct. However, each of these interpretations could, from a perspective of ignorance of relevant historical facts, be correct, and each one is a conceptually possible example of the purposes of a game. The example of the Roman games illustrates the principle that a game can have multiple purposes, some explicit and some implicit, and different players in a game can have different purposes. The explicit purpose or purposes of a game, being explicit, are typically apparent to all. In contrast, probably in most cases, it's unclear to all or almost all observers of a game what all of the implicit purposes of the game are. This is because implicit purposes are, by definition, not stated, and since we can't read each other's thoughts, we have no reliable way of knowing each other's unstated motivations. Furthermore, people can be unaware of their own motivations. It is widely agreed, particularly among experts in psychology, that most of people's mental activity is unconscious, i.e., not witnessed or observed by their conscious minds. This view holds that among people's motivations for things they do, there are their unconscious motivations. Some argue that most or all things we do are influenced at least in part, or even mostly, by unconscious motivations. This is not a psychology text, and I won't try to answer the question of in what ways and to what extent people's behavior is influenced by unconscious motivations. However, if the reader agrees that unconscious motivations exist, then we can say that a game may have an implicit purpose of which no observers have any awareness. Given our limited access to our own minds, and our near lack of access to others' minds, it's clear why probably in most cases it's unclear to all or almost all observers of a game what all of the implicit purposes of the game are. So let's now switch gears. Let's give some examples of things that are not games, which fail to be games in interesting ways that might tell us something about games. Here's an example of a non-game: making toast. If you are a native English speaker, does it sound natural to describe making toast as a game? For me, the answer is that it does not sound natural. Making toast is not a game. It's some other kind of activity. Food preparation. Although I would point out, making toast could be involved in a game, but typically it isn't. It's just making toast. So here are some more examples of activities that are not usually called games. Fixing your toaster, driving to work, working, sleeping, having sex, thinking, conversation, serving on a jury in a court of law, voting. People don't usually call any of these things games, and yet many of them have certain similarities to games. Serving on a jury and voting both have game-like qualities, being group activities governed by socially agreed-upon systems of rules within which people make decisions in order to fulfill the objective of the activity, making a fair decision on the case being presented, or electing representatives and resolving plebiscites, respectively. Conversation and language use in general have many game-like qualities, being subject to many elaborate, largely unspoken rules. Game-like activities can be found strewn throughout life if you look for them. One social norm that seems to apply across societies in general is that even if you are not playing a game that others are playing, you shouldn't violate the rules of their game. For example, if two people are playing chess, it would be against social norms, probably anywhere in the world, to move the pieces on their board as a non-player in the game. One can say that games like chess are embedded within a larger metagame or game-like activity, the game of society, which has meta-rules like don't break the rules of other people's games. I've collected some examples and non-examples of games, and we have a substantial middle ground of things that arguably have both game-like and non-game-like qualities, including voting, serving on a jury, and usually working is also somewhat game-like. So let's use this data to evaluate some possible generalizations about games. Do games always have rules? Can we think of an example of a game that has no rules? Conversation, one might argue, is a game with no rules. In some sense, this is true. People are free to say whatever they want. However, conversation does have many unstated norms that are usually not violated. Paul Grice argued that participants in conversations usually follow certain maxims. They are, to quote, 1. The maxim of quantity, where one tries to be as informative as one possibly can, and gives as much information as is needed, and no more. 2. The maxim of quality, where one tries to be truthful, and does not give information that is false, or that is not supported by evidence. 3. The maxim of relation, where one tries to be relevant, and says things that are pertinent to the discussion. 4. The maxim of manner, when one tries to be as clear, as brief, and as orderly as one can in what one says, and where one avoids obscurity and ambiguity. Obviously, these rules are violated by speakers on a regular basis, but other speakers who perceive the violations of these rules tend to perceive them as social violations or imperfections in some sense. If one agrees with that, then one agrees in the sense that Grice's maxims are rules that speakers in conversations follow. Every conversation will follow rules of grammar and pronunciation, particular to the language being used in the conversation. Further examples of kinds of rules conversations usually follow are rules of etiquette, rules about what things it is and is not appropriate to talk about in a particular context, rules about what words are unacceptable to say, and so forth. Therefore, we can say, as a generalization, that conversations follow rules. Therefore, we can say, the game of conversation is not a counterexample to the claim that games always have rules. Other possible counterexamples, so far as I'm aware, can be disposed of by thinking along similar lines. It looks to me like any acceptance of a game-like activity lacking rules, any appearance of a game-like activity lacking rules, is due to failure to look sufficiently broadly for rules governing the activity. In interpreting this statement, it should be understood that rules need not be inviolable to be rules. When speaking English, people usually follow rules of grammar. Sometimes people violate the rules of grammar they normally follow. Different English speakers sometimes follow different rules of grammar relative to each other. For example, African American Vernacular English, AAVE, has different rules of grammar than Standard American English. He be comin' is grammatically valid AAVE, but not grammatically valid Standard American English. People sometimes follow different linguistic rules in different contexts, as for example, when a black person speaks AAVE with their family and Standard American English at work. Following different linguistic rules in different contexts is called code switching. Everybody has their own unique linguistic habits. Everybody pronounces words slightly differently, understands the meanings of words slightly differently, and so forth. Mostly these differences are too tiny to identify, but the fact that everybody differs slightly in how they produce and process language is illustrated, for example, by the fact that it is possible to identify people's voices and people's handwriting. Therefore, one can say there are as many idiolects, variants specific to an individual, of a natural language, as there are speakers of that language. The foregoing illustrates that there is a great deal of complexity and inconsistency when it comes to rules of English grammar. We can still say, as a generalization, that English speakers, and speakers of every other language, follow the rules of grammar particular to their dialects most of the time when speaking. This illustrates the nuance that can apply when discussing the rules of game-like activities. Rules of game-like activities can be very flexible, granular, fluid, and invisible. So far as our discussion has led us to be able to see, the generalization is true that games and game-like activities follow rules. If there are exceptions to this generalization, they seem to be obscure. The nature of rules is well worth exploring in more depth. However, for the moment I will delay that discussion. Let us now explore other possible generalizations about games. Are games always competitive? The answer appears to be no. For some children's games, such as Peekaboo and Ring Around the Rosie, it's difficult to see any sense in which they are competitive. However, most games are competitive in some sense. Even solitary games usually involve self-competition, trying to learn and do better. Are games always cooperative? Any game which involves multiple people is cooperative in the sense that playing a game requires the players to agree to play the game, as opposed to doing anything else, to put effort towards its execution, and to abide by the rules of the game. Therefore, we can conclude that multiplayer games are always cooperative on some level, and usually competitive on another level. Jordan Peterson made this point in one of his lectures for his course Maps of Meaning. He gave an example much like what follows. In a game of hockey, the members of each team cooperate with each other in their competition with the other team. In addition, the members of each team compete with their team members for a position in the meritocracy of the team. Finally, all the players cooperate with each other in their agreement to play the game and in their execution of gameplay according to the rules. There are a number of different levels of cooperation and competition in this case. In solitary games, the obvious comment would be that there is no cooperation because cooperation requires multiple people. This is true in an obvious sense. However, it's also false in a less obvious sense, in that playing a game requires internal coordination on the part of a person. In order to play a game, a person has to coordinate many different parts of their mind and body, orchestrating their activities in such a way as to accomplish a single task. In the same sense, every activity whatsoever done by a person involves self-cooperation. One could fairly object that the concept of self-cooperation is an undue extension of the term cooperation, and I will not press the point. What conclusion are we led to about whether games are always cooperative? In this case, we're led to no single conclusion. What we've said indicates that if self-cooperation is a form of cooperation, then games are always cooperative, as is every human activity. And, on the other hand, if self-cooperation is not a form of cooperation, then games are not always cooperative. In addition, what we've said indicates that multiplayer games are always cooperative. So, what can we say overall about the meaning of the word game? On this, I'll quote from Wittgenstein in the Philosophical Investigations, Part 1, remarks 66 to 67. Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. I mean board games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. What is common to them all? Don't say, there must be something common, or they will not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. For if you look at them, you will not see something that is common to all, but similarities, relationships, and a whole series of them at that. To repeat, don't think, but look. Look, for example, at board games, with their multifarious relationships. Now pass to card games. Here you find many correspondences with the first group, but many common features drop out, and others appear. When we pass next to ball games, much that is common is retained, but much is lost. Are they all amusing? Compare chess with noughts and crosses, or is there always winning and losing, or competition between players? Think of patience. In ball games there is winning and losing. But when a child throws his ball at the wall and catches it again, this feature has disappeared. Look at the parts played by skill and luck, and at the difference between skill in chess and skill in tennis. Think now of games like Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses. Here is the element of amusement, but how many other characteristic features have disappeared? And we can go through the many other groups of games in the same way, can see how similarities crop up and disappear. And the result of this examination is, we see a complicated network of similarities overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overall similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. I can think of no better expression to characterize these similarities than family resemblances. For the various resemblances between members of a family, build, features, color of eyes, gait, temperament, etc., overlap and crisscross in the same way. And I shall say, games form a family.